Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Community Session 4 on the Western Victoria Transmission Network project. My name is Lauren and I'm delighted to be hosting tonight's session with AEMO. Firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging the various traditional lands on which we are all located today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Similar to previous sessions, we'll begin with a presentation from our guest speakers, followed by Q&A. You're more than welcome to send us any questions you have by typing them into the question box that's on your screen. And if we don't get to your question tonight, AEMO will respond to them in writing after the session. Tonight's session will be recorded and posted on our website tomorrow, and that link is on your screen. So I'll now pass it over to our presenters. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Alex Wonhas, Chief System Design and Engineering Officer at AEMO, Tony Chappel, Chief External Affairs Officer at AEMO, Greg Thorpe, Executive Director at Oakley Greenwood, and Alistair Parker, Executive General Manager, Regulation and External Affairs at AusNet Services.
Thanks very much, Lauren, and good evening, everyone. I'd also like to just pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land where all of you are and where those of us dialing in remotely from other parts of the country are, and their elders, past and present. And Lauren's mentioned my colleagues joining me from AEMO. Alex Wonhas is our Chief System Design and Engineering Officer, and of course Greg Thorpe from Oakley Greenwood and Alistair Parker from AusNet. So we're here tonight to talk about the regulatory investment test for transmission, or as we've all come to know it, the RIT-T. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Lauren. Basically, the way we're going to run tonight is Greg Thorpe will take us through the technical aspects of the process, and then we'll go to questions from all of you, which we'll do our very best to get through all of tonight, and those we don't get through certainly come back in writing. So the next slide, please, Lauren. Just by way of introduction before I hand over to Greg, and I know there have been some questions on this aspect as well about how the electricity infrastructure architecture works in Australia. So energy policy is set nationally by state and federal energy ministers meeting together, and the governance architecture they've established under the National Electricity Law includes a framework where regulation, policy making and market operations and planning are all separately performed functions. So as you get into the energy space, you'll hear about these different market bodies, and you'll see there on the slide the Australian Energy Market Commission, or what we call the AEMC. They're the rule maker. The Australian Energy Regulator does what it says on the tin. They regulate the market and enforce compliance. And then the Australian Energy Market Operator, where Alex and I both work, are responsible for managing the system and the market for both electricity and gas here in the national market, and also in Western Australia, which is a separate market. We're a statutory, an independent corporation set up with an ownership that includes all of the state and federal governments as well as industry members. And we have a variety of responsibilities which we'll deal to tonight, but particularly relevant here are the integrated system planning function and the planning function for the Victorian transmission network. And the legal requirement for how that Victorian transmission network function is carried out here and in other states is really grounded in the regulatory investment test for transmission process. So without further ado, I might hand over to Greg Thorpe to take us through that very important architecture. Over to you, Greg.
Right. Well, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everyone for coming along to hear my attempt at unpacking and hopefully demystifying any parts of the RIT-T, and noting its role as a strategic planning tool, is the way I like to think about it, within a much broader overall planning process for transmission network. The next slide, if I can, Laura. So first a word on my role and my credentials next. As you will gather, I've been requested by AEMO to provide this presentation. I've been requested to do it as an expert but independent presentation that is independent of AEMO. And I will make reference to the Western Victorian project in particular. Next. So my credentials in brief, I won't bore you with a lot, but I've been around for longer than I care to think. And for my sins, I have for part of the time been a transmission system planner. And I have also helped other TNSPs prepare their RIT-Ts, and I've helped the regulator review the veracity of some of the other RIT-Ts. It struck me as I was preparing this that I've also been, quite some time ago, a community representative, basically on your side of the table, being a representative for a local council advisory body. So I can sympathise to some degree, or empathise with you to some degree. A disclaimer, I've already said that I've been engaged by AEMO, but I'm independent. I've not assessed the outcome of what AEMO is doing, but I have I haven't assessed the outcome of what they're doing. So what I'm doing here is not meant to be a comprehensive review. It is not advice that can be relied upon by any party seeking to make commercial and regulatory decisions. So that is my liability piece over and done with. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the topics that I'll cover. What I want to do is to talk a little bit about where a RIT-T fits into transmission planning for new transmission. I want to go over a little bit of the ground that Tony has already mentioned there, that RIT-T sits within the regulatory obligations under the National Electricity Rules. I'll talk about each of the four major parts of a RIT-T, which are need, credible options, assessment of the options, and then selection of a preferred option. And then I'll talk very briefly about what follows, who leads that. So if we can go to the next. I like this diagram. It's one that illustrates how the RIT-T is just one of the tools that I've already mentioned. You can see there's a whole lot of things that go into planning a new transmission network. The RIT-T covers just two of those. So the RIT-T is covering technical and economic issues, but there are a raft of other things, safety, amenity, environment and land use, and others that I couldn't fit on the diagram. So the point is there that RIT-T is just one of the tools. Next. Okay, a RIT-T. I'm going to talk a little bit about the key concepts next. Tony has already indicated that it sits within the national electricity market. It's useful to see how it fits and everything about the rules for the national electricity market are designed to maximise the long-term benefit to consumers, and the RIT-T is no exception to that. What a RIT-T does is it identifies the project option that meets a need, and I'll talk a little bit more about need in a minute, with the highest value or the highest net market benefit to customers. The National Electricity Rules obligate transmission network planners, which is AEMO in Victoria, to undertake a RIT-T, including engaging in industry-wide consultation. The RIT-T is important to TNSPs, that is Transmission Network System Planners, because unless they've done a RIT-T, they can't get recovery of the costs from consumers. So they've got a pretty strong interest. So, as I said before, I'm going to position the RIT-T as a strategic planning tool. And as a strategic planning tool, another way I like to think about the RIT-T is that it joins dots on a map with credible options. It does not tell you how those dots are going to be joined, or exactly what path is to be taken, or exactly what technology. This is decided in later stages of the overall planning. So we're getting there a flavour of what a RIT-T does do and what it does not do. Next. Sorry, I've basically gone through all that. You better go next. Right. This is a diagram of the point that I was making there, that it's got a couple of roles. It's because of the limitation on being able to recover the costs only if a RIT-T has been done, it's commercially pretty important to network planners or to people who are going to spend the money. But it's also part of the checks and balances that are built into the NEM to make sure that the long-term interests of consumers for costs, reliability and security are managed. So I've tried to put a little beam balance there to indicate that trade-off. Next. If we turn now to looking at the Victorian arrangements, Tony has already mentioned, in Victoria, one of AEMO's jobs is to be the network planner for Victorian transmission, which is not the same as it is in other jurisdictions. So it is AEMO who must conduct RIT-Ts. Next. The way it works in Victoria is that having completed a RIT-T, AEMO then tenders for design, permitting, construction, and ultimately operation and ownership of transmission. Next. And in the case of the Western Vic project, that tendering process has taken place and AusNet Services has won the tender. Next. I said there were differences with other jurisdictions, and that difference is that in other jurisdictions, the transmission company also does the strategic planning, which means that the transmission company that's going to own and invest in the new transmission also undertakes the RIT-T. Next. And just a point of detail there for anyone who is associated with maybe one of the projects. A RIT-T is related to the shared network, what is called the shared network, so that if there is a piece of network that is for the exclusive or private use of, let's say, a wind farm connecting up to the shared network, then there are RIT-Ts are not needed because that is something that is organised by contract. We are between the relevant parties. Next. Another one of my diagrams. This is summarising the points that I have been making to date, where we have a RIT-T, which is on the left-hand side there, which is starting off with a formal statement of the need, and then looks at options and then produces a preferred option from which all the other elements of the planning process and eventually ownership follow. So the preferred option is the starting point for all of those other quite important activities. Next. There are 3 stages of the RIT-T, which add progressively more detail to the process. Very briefly, they are the project specification stage, a draft report stage, and a conclusions report stage. For the Western Vic project, AEMO has been through each of the 3 stages, and you can see there the dates that each of them were completed, ranging from the first half of 2017 through to the middle of 2019. Now, I don't intend to go through step by step. I don't think that's really what we're here for tonight, because I'm going to focus on the end-to-end process without being too concerned about which of the 3 stages. For completeness, I'll note that while the RIT-T was underway for the Western Vic project, there were some changes to the rules which gave a different status to actionable projects created under the Integrated System Plan. So rather than duplicate work in the Integrated System Plan, there is a process which will basically short-circuit the very first step to avoid duplication and inefficiencies. Next. Now, this is the framework that I want to talk about mainly tonight. That framework has those 4 parts that you can see on the screen. The first stage is of the proponent, of the people or the entity doing the RIT-T, is to identify a need. Then they create credible options. Then they undertake analysis, and at the end of that comes the preferred option, which, as I've said, is then the starting point for the implementation details to follow. Next. Okay, so most of what I will be saying for the rest of the presentation is going to deal with these 4 stages, one after the other. So the first one is need. Next. There are 2 types of need, and need's always been a strange phrase to me, strange label, but that's what it is. So there are 2 types of need. One can be an economic or market benefit need, and the other can be a pure technical need. Next. If it's an economic or market benefit need, it's saying that action is needed, that is, some sort of new development is needed to ensure that the national electricity market continues to provide maximum economic benefit to consumers. And the converse of that is that unless you do take action, there will be a degradation in the economic operation of the national electricity market that will increase costs to customers in the end. If it's a technical need, next, then action is required to ensure that the power system stays within technical standards for reliability and or security. And when it's one of these type, or when it's a technical need, it's a must do, and the objective of the RIT-T is to find the minimum cost that that technical need can be met. Next. So in the case of the Western Vic project, it's been identified to have a market benefit need. And it has also been identified in the Integrated System Plan as an actionable project. So the administrative details of how it would be considered if it had been done today would be slightly different at the very beginning, first step. I've taken an extract, which I won't read in detail, from the final conclusions report, which summarize or which presents the need as AEMO have identified it. And basically it is that without this, or without some action, then the large amount of new generation expected in the Western Victoria region would not be able to be fully used. And so if it's not fully used, then something else will have to supply the customer load, and that something else will undoubtedly be either less efficient or it'll be a higher cost technology. So that is the need that is being met by the Western Vic project. Next. So moving on to options, first thing to think about is what makes an option credible. If you can remember, that second bubble that I talked about is not just options, it's credible options. Next. So self-evidently, it has to meet the need. Next. This being a regulatory requirement under the rules with the force of law, as I said at the beginning, the national electricity rules set out the formal conditions of how one decides whether you have a credible option. Next. What I've done there is to list out some of the issues that a body like AEMO must consider as they develop up credible options. Just to pick a couple there, they must consider all types of fuel. They must consider network and non-network solutions. And in non-network solutions is whether you can meet the need using contracts with demand shifting or demand lopping, or you can use storage. And there's a number of detailed provisions there spelt out in the rules, which the proponent or the developer of the RIT-T is obligated to follow. Next. So in the Western Vic case, what are the credible options? Well, first of all, the tests for credible options in the West Vic project, AEMO or any proponent is obligated to spell out how they assessed what is a credible option. And AEMO has included those in the final conclusions report. To assist, quote, or to clarify how the guidelines for credible options are to be used. In addition to the rules, the Australian Energy Regulator issues guidelines that are required to be followed by any proponent for a RIT-T. So you've got the rules and you've got the guidelines issued by the AER. Next. So what I did want to do here, first of all, is to talk about other options considered by AEMO, because AEMO is obligated to demonstrate that it has canvassed a range of options. And this is obviously where you can get some debate, some contentious decisions. And I think that's no exception here. Next. So I just want to draw attention to where AEMO has spent some time talking about options, and I've picked two that I know have been contentious and are the subject of some questions. And what I want to do simply is to just refer to where they've done that and give the PADR, that is the middle report, where they have gone through some of the options that AEMO considers would have had a low ranking, and that's undergrounding and partial reuse. And I've got a feeling there might be some further questions that are going to be asked about that. But this is where AEMO have considered some of the other options that were not ranked very highly. Next. And I've already mentioned there that the integrated system plan options are now changed the process a little bit. And also a repeat of the point that this is the early stage strategic planning. Next. So the categories that AEMO, or a range of the options that AEMO did consider, and in this case these are listed again from the middle draft report. They categorised them looking at the different options at one level, as you can see down there on the left hand side, from just doing very minor works to different voltage levels, and then category E was one of the non-network alternatives that they were using. There is a map taken from the PADR. It is probably getting towards the limit of what you can read on the screen, but it is in that middle draft report, if you would like to refer to that. So I'm really just putting that on the screen there to illustrate the concept of the joining the dots on a map type of analysis that a RIT-T does, recognising then that there can be a lot of extra work to follow, as is the case with the Western Vic project. Next. Now I'm moving on here to the analysis and market benefit. So if we recall, this RIT-T has an economic market benefit need, and market benefit in this context is assessed using sophisticated economic modelling of supply and demand. There are a number of well-established commercial packages around which do that, and AEMO do use those. The easiest way to think about what the economic modelling of supply and demand does is it assesses the cost of running the national electricity market with and without the project. And that goes back to my point about economic market benefit. It's not essential because what we're trying to do is to make sure that the national electricity market continues to give the maximum benefit for customers. So we're looking at the with and without the project in this type of analysis. Again, this being the national electricity market and the national electricity rules have something to say on how this analysis is to be done, including what factors can be included and basically what factors are not relevant to the industry assessment of the economics. So there's a list which I think I've briefly discussed before, but you can think about what is the capital cost changes with and without, what is the fuel changes with and without, and it's across the NEM as a whole, as well as the cost of the project itself. And one that takes a little bit of a minute to think about is that if you do this project, you may not have to do another one. So you would spend money building this project, but save money not doing another one. That must be taken into account. Now, in any of this sort of modelling, we are looking forward over a very long time, over decades, because these are very long-lived assets. And there's a lot of uncertainty about, what is the demand growth, what is the rate of inflation, what's the cost of debt, what is the cost of all the plant and equipment that you would include in your modelling. So the National Electricity Rules again specify that a proponent doing a RIT-T must look at a whole range of scenarios for how those variables would be, how those variables might affect the answer. Next. Right, so what I've got here is the first of just a couple of slides. I'm not going to try to delve into the fine detail. I've done that for a living, and I'm pretty sure it's going to glaze the eyes of most sane people. So what this is a presentation of the market benefit of the assessment of options in that middle stage of the draft report. So it's before it goes into the detailed assessment. So the left-hand side has got the net market benefit for the different types of, or the different categories of project. You'll see there on the left, we have the minor works. They've got a negligible benefit. And over on the right-hand side of that graph, you'll see that a storage option that was considered by AEMO, as in fact that option is actually going to cost more than the benefit that it delivers. But the two that have got the biggest potential benefit are the ones labelled B3 and C2. And as I said, these come from the middle draft report, and there's a note down the bottom there to say ultimately when they were taken through to the conclusions report, it turned out that the gap between B3 and C2 grew, so that they were the ones that were the primary candidates. Next. The second of the modelling results that I wanted to show you, this is where the rubber really hits the road for the examination using the sophisticated models. This one is for just option C2, that which did become the preferred option, and it is for the neutral scenario, the mid-range, if you like, of things like demand growth, inflation, cost of plant, etc. And then what the modelling does is it shows you in detail how much savings you get in capital, how much extra fuel you save or use, and you'll see there out towards the end of that graph in green, you'll see that there are some other transmission projects which are not needed, so that was a saving for this particular project. Now, there is a complete package which is on the AEMO website of the outputs of the different options and the different scenarios. So for those of you who have not seen it and would like to, I'd urge you to refer to those. They are many megabytes of detailed outputs from the economic modelling. Now, I said at the beginning, I haven't done assessments of the work that's been done. What I can say is that it's that package of detailed assessments, many versions of what's on the screen now, that I would anticipate seeing from any RIT-T project or any RIT-T that is developed. And it's that sort of detail that I was referring to that I've helped other RIT-T proponents develop or review. So the net market benefit comes out of this type of modelling. This particular graph, I've got a note there, comes from figure 10 on page 47 of the conclusions report. Next, please. Okay, so once all of the scenarios have been examined and the assessment of what overall is the option which delivers the highest net benefit, that is the benefit minus the cost, that becomes the preferred option. And as we've said, in Victoria, the process then is that AEMO then tenders for the detailed next steps. And we've also noted that AusNet has been a successful tenderer to take the process forward. And next slide. So that leaves you with the obvious next question: what happens beyond the RIT-T in for the Western Vic project? Next. So the publication of that conclusions report formally completed the strategic planning phase. Next. And as we've just noted, AusNet Services was the successful tenderer, and AusNet Services now takes the lead for all of the processes that follow and eventually becomes the owner and operator of the asset that is built. So those other processes include the environmental impact statement and liaising with the relevant bodies who are undertaking that, and knocking on doors, talking about access to land use, considering safety, considering different technologies, etc. So the monkey sits on the shoulder of AusNet Services at this point. Next. Again, AusNet Services, the owner and operator of the assets when they're done. And their work is ongoing at the time of this presentation. And finally, I think it's a closing slide. So, thank you. And that concludes what I have prepared. So it's now back over to Tony, I think it is, for question and answer sessions. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Look, we've just got a link up there to a fact sheet that I think is on the project website too, that lays out all of these different elements. So feel free to download that and review it. Now, Lauren, in terms of questions, are you going to?
Yeah, let's get straight into it, I think. So we've had a few questions come through. The first question is, can we get an undertaking from the AEMO presenters that any questions that are not answered tonight on air will be followed up with a written response from AEMO before Christmas?
Look, we'll absolutely answer in writing any questions we don't get to tonight. I'm not sure we can promise to do that before Christmas. It'll probably be early in the new year, but we'll certainly do it in a timely fashion and make sure they're comprehensively answered.
Thank you, Tony. Another question is, can you please explain the role of AEMO and how the electricity market operates? In particular, what are the rules that govern the Australian electricity market? Who makes those rules? And what consequences there are for AEMO or operators if they do not abide by those rules?
Look, that was sort of touched on in my earlier slide. Basically, the rules are made ultimately by governments, by energy ministers together, and then they are enforced by the Australian Energy Regulator. And there's a variety of sanctions there for AEMO or any other participant that is not complying with those rules. It's quite a comprehensive sort of piece of legislation, so it might be something the Australian Energy Regulator can comment on further, but I think hopefully that sort of covers it.
Thank you. Another question is, does AEMO think it is necessary to have a social licence in order to bring the community along with the important projects in the ISP 2020? What does the idea of social licence mean to AEMO?
Look, I think social licence for any major project is critical, and I'm sure all of my AEMO colleagues feel that. In fact, we often talk about when we consider projects like this, we really do try to think about what they mean directly, that if any of us had a home that was going to be impacted by a project like this, how would we feel? And I think that kind of mindset is very much important, and I can understand for a lot of the community thinking about what this project might mean, it can be very concerning. And I think I guess the key place where social licence will ultimately reside for this project is as a result of the environmental effects statement and the program there over some years of integrating all of the social and environmental and economic benefits and disbenefits to try to deliver a project like this in as optimal and socially acceptable fashion as possible. And so I think social licence is absolutely critical. I think, Alistair, you might want to comment a little more on that, but I think we would all be on that page.
Yeah, thanks, Tony, and I think you've put that well. Social licence is everything to this sector, and we want to make sure that we really listen closely to the community. We've seen the pins come on our website, we've seen people give us feedback. We know we're not there yet in terms of people feeling that they've had their say and actually been listened to, so we're really determined in the new year to step that up to another level.
Thank you, Tony and Alistair. Another question is, what process was used by AEMO to ensure a rational approach was correctly applied to natural assets and they were not economically devalued in order to achieve lowest costs and help justify proceeding with the Western Transmission Network project?
Look, I'll throw to my colleagues as well, but I think the sort of framework that the initial consideration of a project like this has to progress through, which is the RIT-T that Greg's talked us through, really doesn't put specific values on most of the what you might call externalities or natural capital values. They're really assessed through the planning assessment process through in Victoria, the environmental effects statement. So I think it's fair to say many of those values have not yet been considered by this project, but are critical to be considered for this project to succeed. And we're right at the beginning now of really the main part of the project consideration and assessment process, where environmental and social capital, if you like, and values and attributes alongside the economic ones will all be considered through that EES process. Alex, would you add anything, or Alistair?
I just really emphasise the point on the EES. I think that's the process by which we've really got to consider thoroughly these questions. We're certainly committed to making sure we put as much information as possible into that EES process, and also committed to making sure that we kind of consult with people about the information that we're putting in, that's available to the community, and that people can challenge and question it. And I think it's one point worth mentioning that certainly I've heard from people who've got a lot more experience than me with EESs, that the nature of that process is to contest the information that's provided into it. And so we will likely produce material. People will see that, they will comment on it, and they will say, you didn't properly address this point, you haven't properly thought about this question, you haven't properly taken into account the circumstances that exist in this area, and we will then have to update the material, rethink it, and make sure that it actually addresses those questions. We're really committed to making that as thorough and as thoughtful and as transparent a process as we possibly can, and making sure that these really detailed questions are properly addressed. And thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Alistair and Tony. Another question is, AEMO, as the project proponent for the project, has contracted AusNet to deliver this project. AusNet and its representatives have provided misleading information to the public and bullied members of the community. As the project proponent, what processes does AEMO have to deal with this such behaviour by AusNet, and how can the public access these processes?
Well, look, I guess I'd just say to that, I think it's a very serious matter. If anybody in our organisation or in any organisation we work with is, behaving in a way that would constitute bullying or any other kind of inappropriate behaviour, so we would certainly take it very seriously. And if there are instances of that kind of behaviour, they can be raised directly with us, and we'll absolutely run them to ground and revert. I know that AusNet also have quite a comprehensive complaint handling process as well, which I would also encourage anyone who feels they want to avail themselves of that to do that, because I know that AusNet have take these issues seriously too. Excuse me.
And Tony, I'll maybe just add to that. I mean, that's really confronting for me to see. I'm personally really disappointed that anybody's been left feeling like that, and we would just take it enormously seriously. I would draw people's attention to our website. If you hop on the main company website, you'll find there a complaints and feedback form that you can log your complaint about, and we would obviously take that very seriously and follow it up. I would also, if people wanted to ring our customer line on 1300 360 795, again, they would log that complaint. There's a process where we get an opportunity to look at that, but ultimately, if the complaint isn't resolved, it then goes to the Ombudsman, and they take every complaint very seriously and will assist people in making sure the complaint is addressed. So to anybody who's felt bullied, I'd just really sincerely like to apologise, and please do use our complaints line to tell us about it.
And look, just to close that out, on our website as well, you'll see a contact us page. There's a phone number as well. I think it's 1300 236 600, but we would absolutely take any complaint made to us very seriously.
Thank you both. Next question is, this project is Victoria's first major transmission network augmentation in over 30 years. As a matter of public interest, would AEMO please make public the contract signed with AusNet in December 2019, redacted as necessary, and if not, why not?
I think I might invite my colleague Alex Wonhas to speak to this one.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, and firstly, a very good evening to everyone. Look, I understand there's probably interest in understanding the contract. As a matter of fact, the contract is actually commercial in confidence, and the reason for that is to protect actually future competitive processes in Victoria, to ensure that ultimately the best price outcome can be achieved. Now, that said, it would be good to understand what's the sort of specific information that people are interested in, and frankly, the keystone figures of the contract are actually no secret at all. When you look at the PACR document, for example, it does include a cost estimate for the project. In MPV terms, that's about $370 million. It also highlights what are the total gross market benefits of the project, which was about $671 million. So for instance, if you're interested in what's the cost that's this being contracted for, it's probably somewhere between those two figures. And I hope that gives people at least an understanding of what is roughly in the contract. I think the other document, if people are interested really in the detail of the contracting process, the expression of interest document that we have published is also publicly available and probably gives you a fairly detailed view of the type of solution that we have been looking for.
Thank you, Alex. Next question is, given the intense and organised community backlash that has arisen to this project since the announcement of the RIT-T outcomes, does AEMO consider the ongoing, persistent and sustained community opposition to the overhead HVAC option is as a risk to the project?
And look, Alistair might want to add to this, but as I said at the start, I think social license is critical for a project like this, and I can understand how confronting some of these processes are when you're not familiar with them and they seem like a fait accompli. And I guess I'd just say, from our point of view, the community having a solution that people can accept and understand brings benefits is very important. So the environmental effects statement process over the next few years is really the place where we hope most of those concerns can be adequately addressed, if not all, and resolved to people's satisfaction. And that's really the key test for us, is what comes out of that process in terms of dealing with the community's concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I think you've put that very well. And one of the things I think that we're certainly very alert to is that it's absolutely legitimate that people have raised these concerns and have organised into protest groups, and we'll certainly want to engage more fully with those groups and make sure we're genuinely understanding those concerns and make sure that we've addressed their point of view over time. I think the thoroughness of the EES process means that we couldn't avoid doing that even if we wanted to, but we know that electrical assets in the community do cause concern, and so we're really committed to just working through that patiently with everybody.
Thank you both. Next question is, under what circumstances would AEMO suspend or modify the current contract with AusNet to investigate the feasibility and cost of credible alternatives, including undergrounding a HVDC solution for this project? Is it a question of government direction and/or government investment?
Look, I think the feedback loop that the legal process contains that Greg went through is probably one avenue where there's a material change that requires the project to be reconsidered. Alex, would you like to expand on that at all?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So, look, I think from our point of view, I think it's really important to actually work through the process now. And I think, as also Alistair and Tony have mentioned, there are a lot of factors that need to be looked at as part of this process that, frankly, the RIT-T process by its nature hasn't looked at in terms of, for example, environmental effects and other impacts. So what we would certainly like to see is that project or process being concluded and then see what is the outcome of that. If there was an outcome that would mean a significant change to the process, as Tony has just highlighted, and as Greg has also highlighted in his presentation, there is actually a feedback loop, and if there's a fundamental change, then we would obviously have to go back to the drawing board and re-examine the different options.
Thank you both. A question from Frank. Did AEMO ask the AER for a decision on whether the extra cost for underground HVDC was warranted and acceptable for this project, given the superior risk mitigation potential that underground HVDC offers over overhead? If not, why not?
Alex, would you like to talk to that, please?
Yeah, look, I can try to address that. So we have not formally asked the AER because, frankly, the rules are actually very clear around the RIT process and how we have to look at costs. And you may disagree with the rules, and we might also even have our own gripes around this process. But it is in the end the rules that we have to follow. And in terms of undergrounding, the way undergrounding plays out in the RIT process, we are looking obviously at the benefits, as Greg has outlined, and they are potentially quite similar for both above ground and underground options. And then we are looking at what would be the additional cost of an underground solution. And what we find is that undergrounding is often 10 times and sometimes even more expensive than the above ground option. And what that basically means is it has, significantly lower or even negative benefits compared to the above ground option. And so by the mechanics of the RIT process, that would require us to rank the underground option very, very low. And that is frankly the reason why the RIT process has put forward an above ground option.
Thank you, Alex. A follow-up question to that is from Vicky. Could we please be provided with the costings that AEMO undertook to assess the potential for HVDC undergrounding? There has to be more than the sentence in the PADR that, quote, building a new transmission cable entirely underground, this option is expected to cost up to 10 times more per kilometre than overhead lines and is not expected to deliver net market benefits.
Yeah, so I think, firstly, in terms of cost estimates, Murable has done its own cost estimates as part of the study that I think you have commissioned back in September. And that actually found some very similar cost estimates to sort of what we have seen. By its nature, those cost estimates are actually very project specific. And I suspect that as part of the EES process, that obviously looks at undergrounding as sort of part of the broader set of options. AusNet is actually going to potentially look at more detailed cost estimates, but I don't know, Alistair, if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, and look, I think that's well put, Alex. One of the things that I've been saying for a little while is, from AusNet's perspective, perhaps the detail wasn't there, and probably not appropriate, as Greg has explained, at that point in the process. But as part of the EES, we're really committed to making sure we air the costs of what it would actually cost in this route in a sensible alignment, and do that really properly, submit it to the sort of scrutiny of the community and other experts, and just understand what it would actually cost in these circumstances, and that allows an informed decision to be made in the EES process. I have to be straightforward. I've been in this industry a long time, and it would be very surprising if the cost of that were outside that sort of range of about 10 times. So it would suffer in a regulatory sense from that very high additional cost. But all the same, I think to help the community sort of understand that for themselves, I think we need to do that work.
Thank you both. The next question is, in the 2016 review of the RIT-T process, it was stated that the RIT-T is designed to be a consultative and transparent process for transmission planning. The test allows for public consultation and comment within a transparent framework. that was the quote. And then it says, the community only heard of the WVTNP in June 2020, more than 3 years after the West Vic RIT-T began. A, why didn't AEMO deliver a transparent public consultation process from the start of the RIT-T? B, during the RIT-T, what consideration did AEMO give to the many submissions that were made by industry bodies and interested parties that flagged key issues with proposed overhead lines along this route corridor, including the fact that the overhead lines would cause significant public backlash, which would risk the project?
So look, the need to engage the community, I think, is something that we really hear loud and clear, that the community feel they would like a much more prominent, active role in this process. And I think going back to the start of this process, AEMO was at great pains to meet and in fact exceed the obligations that the regulatory framework lays out for community engagement. You know, my colleagues at AEMO had direct engagement with a whole series of councils, including Hepburn, Ballarat, Melton, Moorabool, Northern Grampians, and others, with all the registered Aboriginal parties and traditional owner groups and a series of other groups. But you know, despite that, it's clear that for many people, that process did not satisfy them. So I think there's some deep thinking going on now, and work we're doing to consider, and doing this in partnership with local councils, how we might deepen the opportunities for the community going forward. In terms of the feedback that was taken on, well, it was all taken seriously and reviewed, and I think to the extent the feedback was not integrated into the findings of those reports as they progressed, it was simply because they were outside the remit of what those reports are able to consider. And it's really those rules constraints that determine what is able to be taken on board through that RIT-T process.
Thank you, Tony. And sort of related question is, if a RIT-T is one of the checks and balances, what oversight and governance is there of the RIT-T? Who audits the RIT-T findings to ensure errors have not been made or bias has not been included?
So the Australian Energy Regulator, remember at the start I talked about those different roles for the market bodies. It's their job is to enforce compliance with the rules and to enforce that. Alex, anything you would add there?
Tony, you're absolutely right. The AER has ultimate oversight for the compliance of this process, and you know, they take that role very seriously. I think the other thing I would say is in terms of the accuracy of the process and the results, what we have tried to do is being actually very transparent in terms of what are the key input assumptions and what are the key results. So what you can do, you know, if you're a sort of sufficiently skilled person in this field, you can actually take the input assumption and you can reproduce the results of the RIT-T in this narrowly defined way. And that, you know, happens actually frequently along the process for not only this RIT-T, but frankly, all of the other assessment processes that are happening in the energy sector. And that creates a very good feedback loop and quality check loop that, at least from the mechanics point of view, those results are valid. I think, as we have touched upon in this discussion, the sort of confines of the rules obviously push the results in a certain direction, which may not be as inclusive as maybe we all would like them to be.
Thank you, Tony and Alex. Next question is, a statement. Vicky would like to say again, we would like to see your cost estimates, not your estimation of likely 10 times as stated in the PADR. So you will back cost the underground. So you will back cost the underground for the EES, not for the RIT-T.
Look, I mean, in terms of the costs, the analysis that was done in that RIT-T, as Greg laid out, it's a sort of a funnel process, and as you examine different options, they become non-viable in the process when there are more cost-effective options that emerge. But the RIT-T is only one piece of this project assessment, and the environmental effects statement requires option alternatives to be considered through that integrated lens. And that's the work that AusNet will be doing, and we'll be very happy to support them in doing it, but to share transparently how they build up those costs assumptions, to do that with the community, I think, before they finalise their own input into that process, so that the community can see those and validate them against other work, for example, the council's own work and analysis and other sources. And then that will go into that independent process to be assessed. So I think that would be a comprehensive way to understand how the industry or other parties see these different costs.
Maybe Tony, just to build on this, I mean, we talked a lot about the cost of the RIT-T, sorry, not the cost of the RIT-T, the cost of undergrounding. But I think what is also important to bear in mind is that undergrounding is not necessarily a silver bullet solution, unfortunately, because apart from the cost, it also has some other drawbacks. And I think that we all need to think about that very carefully. During the construction, it's actually a much more invasive process. So you get, because there's much more material movement, there's probably 10 times the number of truck movements compared to an overhead line. There is a maybe 3 times higher impact on the land. It takes longer to construct, and that's not just a theoretical statement, but that basically means that there's longer disruptions to access, to dust, noise, etc. And the process in itself is much more invasive. So when you lay the trench, it can actually isolate properties. So that's during the construction phase, and then during the operation, it's also not without its challenges, because the land above the undergrounded cable needs to be sterilized. So that's again quite invasive, and then it requires much more frequent access for maintenance on an annual basis to ensure that the system operates. So it's not as easy as just let's pay some more money and we have a perfect solution in place, unfortunately.
But I mean, I think to all of those points, good and bad, environmentally, socially and economically, they all need to be transparently laid out for this project to ultimately achieve a social license and to achieve approval. And as we said in the RIT-T presentation, if there are material changes, that feeds back into the process. So that's, I think, the work now ahead of us for the next few years, to work through all of that and see what the set of solutions is that we can land on, and then that can pass that process ultimately if the project is to succeed.
Thank you both. Going back to the EES, question is asked, if AusNet are the proponent who are promoting an overhead HVAC solution, how can they be trusted to properly consider alternatives under the EES process? It is not in their interest to do so, and if, say, for example, undergrounding was excluded, then surely it is not in AEMO's interest to do so either.
Well, I think it's just required really by the EES process, but Alistair, would you like to talk to that?
Yeah, and look, it's a good question, but we're, to Tony's point, even if we wanted to dodge the question, I think there's just no way, given the sort of scope that our people are putting there. But we are committed to making sure this is examined properly. And look, we had a few questions about the contract earlier, and I just want to say really simply, and I think Tony and Alex have made this point about the EES and the RIT-T. There's a feedback loop. I mean, we're absolutely clear that the contract we have doesn't trump an EES process. If, in fact, as we go through the EES process, we find that there are really good reasons for areas or even the length to be underground, we're all going to have to go through those feedback loops and think about that. So we shouldn't be distracted by the fact that we are contracted to provide this overhead solution. That fell out of the RIT-T process. We will pursue that, of course, because that's what we're contracted to do. But as part of that, we have to provide really thorough, really good information to the community and to the experts in the EES process to make sure that holistically, taking everything into account, that would in fact prove to be the right answer. And if it proves it's not the right answer, then we're going to have to, as Alex put it, go back to the drawing board.
Thank you, Alistair. Okay, last question, just because we've definitely gone over time. AEMO's RIT-T process for West Victoria defaulted to old methods using overhead HVAC systems without much consideration of contemporary technologies and alternatives. How has the AEMO integrated system planning and RIT-T process allowed for and encouraged innovation and the entry of new technology and ideas to minimise risk to the community and improve efficiency, resilience and stability of electrical supply?
Alex, why don't you take this one?
Thanks, Tony. And look, it's a great question. And I'm actually personally very, very passionate about what new technologies and innovation can deliver to the electricity market. And to be honest, there's been a great example of how innovation can actually avoid building new transmission lines. And we have just recently successfully completed on behalf of the Victorian government, which was called the System Integrity Protection Scheme process, which is a bit of a mouthful, but actually it is a large-scale battery that we are actually putting at Moorabool, and that allows us to increase the transfer capacity of the New South Wales to Victorian interconnector by up to 250 megawatts. I think that's a great example of a cost-effective solution. So very passionate about that. Unfortunately, for the issues that we have to solve with creating connection space for renewables in Western Victoria, that solution, we have actually looked at it, but it basically just didn't stack up. And I might actually also use this as an opportunity to just touch upon is the HVDC solution, which I think many people have highlighted as well. I think the important thing to understand for HVDC is it's actually a point-to-point connection, and it does not allow to the integration of renewables along the way, which is one of the sort of benefits that have been counted for this project. And therefore, HVDC is a technology sort of, again, did not actually pass the hurdle of the RIT-T test in this particular case. But I think in general, we need to see much more innovative solution, and we are absolutely open for that.
And just to add to Alex's point there, the Moorabool battery he's talking about is the suburb near Geelong.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there. Thank you to all of our presenters for staying a bit longer and answering all the many questions that we have. Just to reiterate that if we didn't get to your question tonight, whether it was pre-submitted or whether it was sent through via the question box, AEMO will respond to all questions and comments in writing following this session. And we will assist in helping them to circulate that and making sure that you can all view and read the answers. Please stay tuned for more community sessions. Details will be posted on our website and social media pages. And thank you again, Alex, Tony, Greg, and Alistair for speaking with our community this evening. And thank you to everyone for getting involved. We hope you enjoyed the session and the series so far. Have a great evening and take care.
Thanks very much, Lauren.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.